Episode 6, NIRS and Cycling Performance. Welcome to the Oxidative Potential Podcast, where we discuss all things sports science and performance. I'm your host, Matthew DeRoche, and with me is my fellow co-host, Phil Batterson. Enjoy. Hey folks, on today's episode, Phil and I discuss NIRS and his research that he had conducted for his master's on the applications of NIRS for predicting endurance performance versus like some of the classical predictors that have been out there, like we talked about in previous episodes. So Phil does a great job at discussing why did they choose to study this in the first place. Also, what it's like to be a part of a study in general, like for exercise physiology, which is pretty cool for people that haven't had that opportunity or experience. So you kind of get an insight of like what actually goes on in the lab. What are they capturing? What do you do when you show up for testing there? Also, he talks about some of the absolutely like insane findings, really. Like he says in the podcast, he definitely wants them to be repeated because like I haven't seen much repeated on this either in the research, but I think they're really onto something. It holds a lot of potential, so I'd really like to see more research on this. So if you guys want to hear about NIRS and what its applications are in this research, what they found, and some of the science behind that, take a listen, and I think you'll gain a lot of interesting insight here. So hope you enjoy, and catch you later, folks. All right, folks. Today we are going to bring to you some of Phil's research that he had previously done a few years ago on essentially using NIRS and trying to understand how does that correlate to the most classical traditional models of human performance endurance. So basically some of the concepts we've been talking about earlier, performance VO2 and economy, these were used as performance markers for endurance athletes. And what Phil and his group wanted to understand is how does the NIRS measurements, or are there specific NIRS data that comes out to maybe correlate with these performance indicators of the traditional source? So what they studied was cycling endurance, which is very easy to quantify over things like running. There's much less variables when you stick someone on a cycle ergometer. So what they did was they captured their classical markers like the VO2 max, gross efficiency, economy, these things, and then they basically had them do a 25-kilometer time trial, and they also captured some NIRS data to see, okay, how does this all fit together? So let's just start about why you asked this question in the first place. Why was this something that you thought needed to be better understood or investigated further, Phil?
Yeah. So so it's just a little background story. So I did my master's degree at the University of Colorado Springs. So an offshoot of the University of Colorado system under Dr. Robert Jacobs. And what Dr. Jacobs had been finding during his PhD work and his postdoc work was that there were very high predictive ability for like mitochondrial oxidative capacity for endurance performance. So he was really interested. So during his PhD and postdoc, he was actually taking muscle samples from people and then respiring them in oxygraphs. And that's generally the best way of evaluating mitochondrial respiration capacity. We did not have that luxury at University of Colorado Springs. So what he wanted to do is he was like, well, doesn't seem like, like this Joyner and Coyle paper that came out in 2008 didn't really, nobody had really seemed to evaluate do these three variables, VO2 max, threshold, fatigue threshold, and efficiency, do they actually correlate with endurance performance? There, obviously a lot of literature behind all of this, but there wasn't any studies that had put all that together to see what the predictive ability of those variables were. So that was the first objective, was that we wanted to just see, hey, if we measure all of these three variables, how predictive are they of a time trial performance that we do in the same day? And then on top of that, there was some new literature that had started to come out using near infrared spectroscopy that showed that with a certain cuffing protocol developed by Terrence Ryan and McCulley, and I can't remember his first name right now, but those two had basically shown that using a cuffing protocol with NIRS was highly correlated to mitochondrial oxidative capacity using the oxygraph that Dr. Jacobs had used in the past. So we were like, well, if we can't measure respiration in a chamber, might as well measure it in somebody's leg using near infrared spectroscopy, because we did have a NIRS device on campus at the time. So the next thing we wanted to do is we wanted to see how well muscle oxidative capacity actually did at predicting performance. And with the idea that kind of my overarching dissertation thesis was that the skeletal muscle mitochondria kind of are linked and related to everything from VO2 max to fatigue threshold to efficiency and economy. So we were like, well, if that's truly the case, then mitochondrial oxidative capacity is going to be a very large predictor of endurance performance, because it is related to all three of those variables that were thought to predict performance. So that was the impetus for the study.
Nice. So when you guys started this, what was your initial hypothesis? What did you guys think the type of correlations you're going to see between NIRS and the classical predictors?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't think we actually ever did any correlations between our muscle oxidative capacity and then individual variables, which I'm thinking now, I'm like, oh, that's like no brainer. Why don't we actually do that? So maybe another study coming down the pipeline. But our initial hypothesis was that, we were going to have a very high amount of predictive ability for these three, the combination of three variables, traditional predictors of performance, VO2 max, fatigue threshold, and efficiency. We were like, yeah, it's probably going to hold true, because there had been some studies done in runners where they showed pretty high predictive ability, and those sort of things. But then we were also thinking, we were like, well, with the idea that this mitochondrial oxidative capacity is related to all three of these variables, most likely we're going to have a higher predictive ability after using the NIRS device compared to all three of those variables together. So that was like our oh, if this actually works out, like that would be really cool. So that was our initial hypothesis. Traditional variables would be really good. However, muscle oxidative capacity would be even higher than all three of those combined.
Okay. So let's start moving into the experimental design, kind of understanding what exactly did you test. We talked about the classical, performance indicators like VO2 max. We obviously understand, but, can we start to understand how many people you had in the study? What were the time scales that you used for testing? Did they come in, weeks apart? What was the level of fitness of these individuals?
Yeah.
Maybe start to discuss some of these parameters.
Yeah. So we wanted to, so we basically, my goal was just to get as many endurance trained athletes in as possible. So I eventually, got like upwards of like 30, 35 people that we took through this protocol that I'll discuss in a moment. But what we ended up focusing on was 24 highly trained male cyclists. And the reason for that is we wanted to basically make our groups as uh, homogeneous as possible. So,
Mhm.
so generally in research, right, people are trying to extend and get like a wide sample so they can say, oh, over, all of these different um, groups,
Yeah.
we found this predictive ability. But what we really wanted to do, since a lot of the literature was pointing towards, oh, VO2 max isn't a good predictor of performance when you have a
Mhm.
group of very similar people. So
Yeah,
we wanted to
exactly.
try to get as similar people as possible to try to suss out like what was actually a good predictor of performance. So
Nice.
we had people come in once. So it was
Yeah.
just a single non-repeated uh, study.
Mhm.
They were, relatively, like I want to say average.
Yeah.
Like the age range is like, so about 35 years old, about 6 foot tall, um, 76 kilograms, which is what, 160, 170 pounds.
Yeah.
Um, and let's see, I'll go down to like their VO2 max. Pretty sure it was like 59 plus or minus,
Yeah. It
something
was
like
in that
that.
range. It was in the 50s, I believe.
Yeah. So generally, trained population, um, and we had a fairly large distribution of VO2 maxes. Like we had one guy that we measured who was a what was he? He was the collegiate triathlon national champion the year before, and his VO2
Okay.
max was like 74.
Oh, nice.
And he just absolutely like just crushed everybody on the 25-kilometer time trial. Like
Yeah, yeah.
if if the completion time was like normally like 50 minutes,
Yeah.
for like the rest of our people, he went like 44, like something like that. It was absolutely
Yeah.
absurd. We were just like, oh my gosh, like this guy truly is kind of like the cream of the crop here.
Yeah.
um so so that's kind of the participant characteristics. And if you look at the power, so we have um average 25-kilometer power output. So this was, over the course of, oh man, why is everything? So we reported the time trial outcomes in seconds. Um,
Oh, yeah.
so let me just divide that by 60. So yeah,
Yeah.
45 minutes was like the average. So most people were able to maintain about 215 watts, which resulted in a power to weight ratio of about 2.84 watts per kilogram, which,
Mhm.
from a categorization standpoint, would probably, not put people in like cat one or anything like that.
No, no.
But
Unfortunately.
yeah, but like 2.8. So, like almost up to that 3 watts per kilogram. So while not like, on kind of like the elite level, maybe a step down, from
Yeah.
that, like be able to be competitive in like lower level stuff.
Yeah.
All right. So what we actually did though was a number of different things, and I can kind of just walk us through what it would be like, say, if you came in, Matt.
Sure.
So you would get there, and since we did everything on one day, we would, read you the informed consent, which basically tells you all about the study. Um, then what we would do is we would measure your, or have you like get into your cycling gear, like that sort of stuff, and then we would measure your adipose tissue thickness using an ultrasound. And that's important because with NIRS devices, the signal is going through your skin, your fat, into your muscle. So you want to make sure that you are taking into account the adipose tissue thickness.
Mhm. I don't have any, so I don't think you guys would have issues there.
Right,
Yeah. It's okay though.
right. Yeah, so I mean, most of these participants had very low adipose tissue thickness. So the amount of interference with the signal is probably fairly minimal.
Hmm.
Um, and then what we would do is we would basically get you all hooked up. We would have a heart rate monitor on you. We would put a Moxie on one vastus lateralis, and then we would put a um, Oxymon MK3, which is, kind of Artinus's research grade NIRS device,
Hmm.
on the other vastus lateralis. And with that device, it's actually corded. So once we get you hooked up to that, you pretty much are just like corded and locked into
Yeah.
the bike afterwards.
Yeah.
Um, so that would be on your leg, and then we would use like ace bandages and stuff to try to minimize any sort of light penetrating into the signal and stuff like that. Um, And let's see, I'm trying to think of other. Oh, and then we would have a mask on you.
Hmm.
So we would do gas analysis. And I think we used, in this case, we didn't use a parvo, but we used, uh, there it is,
Yeah.
a Med Graphics
Yeah.
Ultima. Um, very similar
Yeah.
to the gold standard of breath by breath gas analysis. Then what we would have participants do is they start cycling for 7.5 minutes at 50 watts, and then 7.5 minutes at 100 watts at 80 RPMs. And this was to get measures of uh, absolute efficiency. So we wanted to figure out what people's efficiency were at these super low wattages. Um, and we capped cadence at 80 RPMs because efficiency has been shown to change with different RPMs. Granted, like the argument could be, well, why not use self-selected RPM?
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, and I think the reason behind that is that we were thinking that if we just capped everybody at 80, then we're controlling more of the variables. So
Yeah.
it could have gone either way, honestly. After the first 15 minutes, the two stages, we would start to ramp participants up at about 26 watts per minute. Um, that changed based on cycling experience and other things like that. But what we were
Yeah.
trying to aim for was about 8 to 12 minutes worth of ramp test cycling, because that's been shown to be pretty much optimal timing to get VO2 max.
Yeah. For sure.
We would just have these people keep riding and riding and riding until they couldn't sustain a cadence greater than 55 RPMs anymore.
Hmm.
And towards the end, right, if you've ever done a VO2 max test, they're brutal. Like we would be cheering people on, and the floor that we were on had just a bunch of like biology labs like near it
Okay.
and stuff. So people would be like, what the hell are they doing in there? Just screaming at their
Pandemonium.
participants and stuff. We
Funny.
weren't torturing them. We were encouraging them to do as best they possibly could. Uh, so we do that, and then we'd verify, that their VO2 peak was reached, all that sort of stuff. And then we would give them about a 10-minute rest where we would keep them on the bike, slowly pedaling, kind of freely, just to flush the legs and keep them kind of going. Then we would do exercise test 2, which was a program test. So this bike that we used allows us to program in certain power outputs and everything like that. So the
Yeah.
bike is actually capped at whatever power output. It doesn't matter how fast you spin, that power output is just constantly being adjusted. So it's super cool.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, they're like $5,000 or plus, which makes it a little bit out of reach for general
Yeah.
population.
They're super expensive.
Yeah. Um, so then what we would do is we did a VO2 max verification, and this is from recommendations with Dr. Poole and Dr. Jones, basically saying that we need to do a VO2 max verification to make sure that somebody is actually reaching some semblance of a VO2 max on your first test. And what we would do with this is we'd ramp them up to 110% of the maximal wattage that they reached on their first. And then
Yeah.
we would just have them hold that as long as they possibly could. Again, pretty brutal.
Yeah.
Um, so we did that, but that was after. So I'm kind of going backwards. That was after we did 2 relative power output trials where we did 15% for 7.5 minutes and 30% for 7.5 minutes, to again try to figure out economy and efficiency values at 80 RPMs. And again, this was just to take into account differences in people's aerobic fitness, right? Because
Mhm.
50 watts might actually, like 50 watts feels like absolutely nothing if if you have trained on a cycle ergometer at all.
Yeah. It
Um,
feels like you can't even put power into the pedals because
exactly.
every time you press, it's like, yeah, it's very strange
Mm-hmm.
powering at that.
Yeah. So we wanted to try to take that into account. And I've been thinking about this a little bit more, is like, um, it might be worth it for people to try to figure out efficiency and economy closer towards like FTP,
Hmm.
because who cares what your economy is at like 30%? If all
Yeah.
of a sudden when you get close to FTP, your form goes to shit, or like, something like that changes where your economy drastically is altered, then it doesn't matter what your economy is at very low, because you're not going to race there, right?
Exactly. This is a good point that you brought up. And sorry, what you notice in, like, for example, the Nike Breaking 2 study is they measured economy close to race pace. They didn't
Mm-hmm.
just measure economy at 10 kilometers per hour or, whatever, 12. Some of these, traditional tests for economy are generally capped to 14 kilometers an hour, 16 kilometers an hour. How relevant that is to an individual that may spend zero time there, especially for some of these. I'm not saying they don't spend any time there, but they spend very little time there. And
Mm-hmm.
that actually does make a difference for economy. And that's why you see these gross differences when you're measuring, some of these economy parameters, and there's different levels of fitness within that. So you see people that, should have a better economy at that pace, but they don't spend a lot of time there. It's kind of like most people are very inefficient at that, that run walk crossover point,
Mm-hmm.
right? That awkward phase of trying to switch over because they don't spend
Yeah.
much time there. Who's going to spend time training there?
Yeah, or at 50 watts, right? Like
Exactly.
it feels
Exactly.
like, the pedals are almost falling. So then you're
Exactly.
almost putting on the brakes with your muscles, and you could potentially
Yeah.
be contracting, differently.
Co-contractions. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So that was something, if I were to go back, I might recommend trying a higher efficiency
Hmm.
calculation. Um, alongside these like low level ones, because these also kind of acted as like a warm up as well, right? 15 minutes
Yeah.
at
Yeah.
15 and
Obviously. Yeah.
30% respectively, like not
Yeah.
too much. So then we ramped them up over 60 seconds to 110% of peak power output, and just had them hold it as long as they could. And I don't think anybody um, reached a VO2 max value that was higher during the second test compared to the first test. So kind of validation for what we were using it for, which is,
Yeah.
ensuring that VO2 max was reached during the first test.
Yeah.
Then after that, what we would do is we would have participants basically just like sit in a lawn chair in our lab for an hour, kind of just resting and those sort of things. And during that time, what we did is the first thing we did is we took them off and we put a Hokinson blood pressure cuff on each thigh. And this is a pressurizing system that allows for rapid inflation and deflation of um, a blood pressure cuff, essentially. And what you can do is you can then calibrate your NIRS signal. So the first thing we did is we calibrated our NIRS signal by inflating the cuffs
Hmm.
and basically to higher than arterial blood pressure,
Hmm.
which ideally should cut off most, if not all, blood flow into the muscle. So
Yeah.
then you're kind of getting rid of changes in, blood volume,
Hmm.
and you're trying to figure out what's the 0 point of our signal,
Hmm.
because with continuous wave NIRS devices, um, there's no way to know what the 0 point is. All it is
Yeah.
measuring intensity of light that's coming back in those changes. So you
Yeah.
need to figure out what the 0 point is. So you inflate this cuff for 3 to 5 minutes, and essentially there's like a big plateau where it gets low and just stays low. And then you release that cuff, and then you see this hyperemic response. So you see this infusion of oxygenated blood and just total blood volume that eventually reaches a peak, and that is what's used as your 0% and then your 100%. And then that allows you to compare these continuous wave NIRS devices across participants. Um, so we did that. And then immediately following that, we did uh, it was a cuffing protocol where we would have people um, contract their legs as hard as they could for 30 seconds, 15 to 30 seconds. I can't remember the exact amount of time. But then when they were done with that, we would have them relax as much as possible. And then we would rapidly inflate and then deflate the cuff. inflate, deflate the cuff. And what that allows for is you to get an idea of the slope of reoxygenation within that signal. Then you can graph that slope, and then you can fit a curve constant to it. And that's what's actually used as your mitochondrial respiratory capacity in a sense.
Yeah, this is actually very similar for people listening if they want to understand more about these types of protocols. This is very similar to like the basic version, which is a vascular occlusion test, right? Essentially, where you would go and cuff in individuals, whether that's thigh or arm. You'd place a NIRS device uh, distal from the heart away from that cuff. And then basically there's different protocols out there where you would keep the cuff inflated for 3 to 5 minutes, or people look for a plateau. There's different ways of doing it. And then essentially release the pressure in the cuff and watch that resaturation slope. So that resaturation slope, what Phil keeps talking about, is actually something very important to understanding, you know, what is the vascular density in that individual? That's one kind of concept, or capillary density, right? An individual with more capillary density is going to have a faster slope of reoxygenation. So yeah, these are protocols that have been used for understanding certain things about vascular diseases and conditions, but we also see some parallels drawn to performance as well. If you look at some of the research comparing athletic individuals or fit individuals compared to controls or compared to diseased or individuals with specific vascular conditions, you see actually quite a large variance there between the groups,
Mm-hmm.
differences. So this is I know people are like, cuffing. Why is cuffing have any relevance to performance? But it's actually a huge tool here to understand what's going on in the muscle with hemodynamics.
Right, right. And just to go a little further with that, the people with worse or flatter reoxygenation slopes are generally the ones that have things like metabolic disease or COPD or other things like that. Whereas those trained athletes, it's amazing how quickly they can reoxygenate. Um, so so what's really interesting and what's really cool about this is that you could potentially measure somebody's slope of reoxygenation or oxidative potential without having to do any VO2 max tests
Yeah.
or efficiency tests or anything like that. So
This
I
is
think
something. Sorry,
that's
go
like
ahead.
that's the big sell for me is like
Yeah.
you all you have to do. I say all you have to do because inflating these cuffs to above arterial pressure is not comfortable
Yeah.
for 3 to 5 minutes. So there's that trade-off. But would you rather have the 3 to 5 minutes of being uncomfortable with your legs or having to exercise absolutely as hard as you possibly can?
Yeah.
For anywhere between 10 and 30 minutes.
Yeah, this is something that I actually incorporated into my practice because it serves, obviously, Moxie isn't as good if it's not in the same realm as the Oxymon, right? It's not in the same realm, but it still gives a good proxy of
Mm-hmm.
resaturation slope, right? It's still on the point where, yeah, you can understand when someone, especially tissue specific, right? Even comparing a deltoid to a rectus femoris in a cyclist, right? You're gonna see drastic differences there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just the that slope of reoxygenation is what is correlated to that mitochondrial respiratory capacity from
Yeah.
muscle biopsies. So again, a non-invasive way of measuring mitochondrial function in a sense, um, which is cool and has a lot of potential, for the field,
Amazing.
because uh, there's not like in the research that I've done in my PhD, most of the time people are very hesitant to get a muscle biopsy. Very rightfully so, right? It's a minor
Mhm.
surgery procedure. But if you could measure muscle respiratory capacity without having to do a muscle biopsy, then you kind of expand your ability to measure this across different populations, maybe even elite level individuals who are, probably the most finicky and
Mhm.
apprehensive to do these sort of research studies because getting a muscle biopsy is invasive. But yeah, uh, so I think that was kind of like the really cool aspect of this, right? Is we
Yeah.
did the VO2 max test, and then right in the middle of that, we did this cuffing protocol.
Mm.
And then the last thing we did is we had people the last thing we did is had people get on the bike and do a 25-kilometer time trial. So overall, these this study day took probably about 4 hours. We asked a
Yeah.
lot of our participants, um, and and one of the cool things about like trained cyclists and those sort of things is that they're willing to do a little bit of hard work, especially to get like measures of adipose tissue thickness. So we can use the or we could use the what did we do? We actually had them come in and we had a DEXA scanner on
Oh, nice.
campus. So we would give them DEXA scan. We would give them their VO2 max values, their efficiency values, and we had this really like pretty printout form for them that my advisor would go over with them and send it to them, and those sort of things. So they weren't compensated monetarily, but they were compensated given all of these performance variables
Yeah.
that we measured for them. So yeah, I was one of the participants, so I know how
Oh,
hard it
really?
was. Yeah.
That's awesome.
But it was a lot of fun,
Yeah.
and the all the participants were really great. So huge shout out to them, because without them we wouldn't actually be able to do this research. Um, so I guess we can, for the last like 15 minutes, let's talk about findings.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that's that's probably what people are like, well, what the heck actually happened?
Yeah.
Um, so also, if you want to read this paper, it's freely available because we published it in an open source journal.
Mm.
Physiological reports. Matt, if you wouldn't mind putting that like in the show note descriptions or whatever,
For sure.
that would be awesome. And if you can't find it, just shoot me an email or just shoot me an email or shoot me a message on Instagram, and I'll gladly send you the PDF, because that's allowed since I am an author on this paper. Um, so the first thing that we did is we took all of these variables. I think it's like, we had multiple variables related to VO2 max, multiple variables related to fatigue thresholds, inefficiency, and then skeletal muscle respiratory capacity. And first, what we did is we just looked at the individual variables' predictive performance for time trial completion. And that's what the first few figures are looking at, are what was the predictive ability of, say relative VO2 max for, time trial outcomes. And what did we get up to? Yeah. So for relative VO2 max, we could predict about 50% of the variance in time trial performance. So
Mm.
while we did say we wanted to try to have, a homogenous group of people, VO2 max still predicted performance pretty well. 50%
Yeah.
of the variance in time trial performance.
Yeah.
So it is important to have a high VO2 max. And I think I just saw something by Evan Pycon, where, he's talking about CrossFit athletes because that's his thing. And he said, VO2 max is necessary for, endurance performance, CrossFit performance, all of this sort of stuff. But it's not the end all be all.
Yeah.
So again, we kind of confirm that here. And then what we went on to do is look at all of our measures of, fatigue threshold. So there was a bunch of gas exchange fatigue threshold measurements that we used, and we found that, the highest predictive ability was the ventilatory equivalence method, and that could predict about 66% of endurance performance. Pretty strong again.
That's super strong. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just for that one.
Yeah, just for one variable. And it's been shown that ventilatory measures are generally a little bit better at predicting endurance performance, especially in cyclists, compared to lactate measures. So I am always hesitant to use lactate just because I know that ventilatory variables are generally better at predicting endurance performance. One of the guys on my committee was one of these authors that explored differences in lactate and ventilatory thresholds and showed that ventilatory thresholds are most likely better predictors of endurance performance compared to lactate. Um,
Yeah. Because
so,
if you just think about that too, there's a lot of reasons why that makes sense, right?
right.
Yeah.
A little bit more granular in terms of, breath by breath estimates and those sort of things. Like lactate
Hmm.
is like um, you have to reach steady states and you have to make sure that somebody's resting, and then you can either get it from the earlobe or the finger. And if you squeeze too hard on the finger, then you
Exactly.
can, change your variables around. I
Yeah.
understand like the ease of use, like you just prick somebody's finger and then use like your lactate meter.
Yeah.
So I get it, but I'm also, it's a little invasive, right? Like, you're poking
Yeah,
someone's finger.
exactly.
It's not the most comfortable sort of thing.
Yeah.
And then you're dealing with blood and other things like that too, as like a
Yeah.
coach and athlete. It's like, I like my athletes, but I don't want their blood on me. Like that's
Yeah. You're gloving up, you're dealing with paper towel, and everything's
right.
flying everywhere, trying to get
Yeah.
sweat off them. It's not the most enjoyable process of
Yes.
testing.
Yeah, exactly. Um, all right. So now let's go to, the economy variables. Um, so for the economy variables, the best predictor of performance was gross efficiency at 15% of peak power output, which is like, that's so low.
Yeah.
But 57.5% of the variance predictive of, time trial performance, which is pretty crazy. Um, and then I'm trying to figure out so then what my advisor did is just we graphed wattage versus things like economy, gross efficiency, and cycling economy, and showed a little bit more in-depth look at. Oh, right. Okay. Here we go. So we collected efficiency values at 50 watts, at 100 watts, at 15%, and at 30%. So
Mhm.
then what we did is we pooled all that data together. So just based off of, like 4 sub-maximal 7.5 minute cycling stages. Then what we looked at is just the R squared value of like, or how well. I don't. I'm sorry. I don't know why we showed that. I'm trying to think, but essentially, the I think what we're trying to show is that with higher wattage, you actually see higher efficiency values because there's a strong correlation of watts going up and then efficiency going up.
Mhm.
So directly related to each other. So something to be aware of, right, is that,
Mhm.
you pretty much should be collecting uh, efficiency values at the same wattage, because at least in the sub maximal stages, like from 0 to 150, we're seeing a positive correlation between the two. That's what we were going for. So something to be aware of. All right,
So,
go ahead.
so in terms of there's just something that I think we should throw out is that there's a difference between cycling efficiency and gross economy that I think a lot of people miss. Just gloss over that right quick because I think people
Yeah,
just kind of loop them into the same bucket there most of
right.
the time. Yeah.
Yeah. So generally the definitions of like economy and efficiency are different in the sense that economy is the oxygen cost per speed or power output, and then
Mhm.
efficiency is the energy cost.
Mhm.
And the reason why we can get a percentage for like say gross efficiency is because we have energy cost over energy expenditure, because power
Mhm.
output is a measure of energy expenditure.
Work. Yeah.
um, Whereas let's see, what's it? Yeah, so exercise economy is slightly different because we used energy expenditure, which takes into account VO2 and VCO2.
Mhm.
And then cycling economy just takes into account oxygen consumption.
Yeah.
So if you're using something like a VO2 master or something like that, you're really only able to measure currently economy values,
Mm-hmm.
specifically cycling economy or running economy, because you're only able to collect oxygen.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're using a PNOE, you would probably be able to do efficiency values as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Just good thing to point out there, because
Yeah.
people might hear that and wonder what the differences are.
Mm-hmm. So then after we identified all of these, individual variables and how well they predicted performance, we put them all together with our or we tried to do some linear regression and modeling analysis to see what the combination of all of these, bins of variables, so VO2, fatigue thresholds, and efficiency economy values, and our so we had 3 predictive models that kind of came out on top. One of them was able to, and this is so traditional models. So again, the ones that were described, Joyner and Coyle paper, 81% of time trial performance was able to explain by a combination of those 3 variables. So 3 of our models, the lowest was 73.4, the highest was 81.8, all really high.
Yeah.
Pretty good, very
Pretty
good
impressive.
predictive performance. What's interesting about that though is, right, we showed that VO2, like our best indicator of VO2 was like 50%. Our best indicator of fatigue threshold was like 60 or 70%.
Mm-hmm.
And then with efficiency also like 60 or 70%. So by putting those variables together, you're not really gaining too much more predictive ability, maybe like 20%. So interestingly, maybe these individual, maybe just collecting one of the variables is able to predict a decent amount of, variance in cycling performance. But then the big thing was when we measured the slope, the rate of change of slope. So like basically the slope of the slope.
Yeah.
Of muscle reoxygenation, that explained almost 92.7% of the variance in time trial performance.
Which is absolutely insane. If people haven't, like, if you go out there and try and find anything in sports performance that has that amount of predictive power, I'd love to hear it. I mean,
Yeah.
yes. I mean, yeah, there might be some sports like someone's jump height and high jumping. Yeah. But
Well, yeah.
this is a little bit different, right? We're talking about physiological metrics,
Mm-hmm.
and performance, right?
Yeah. So that's a massive amount of variability predicted just from one single variable. And I would love if people could recapitulate this study with other populations, elite level athletes, other things like that, because if this holds true, then we could potentially have like a new method of predicting sports performance. And obviously, like with racing and stuff like that, like there's a lot more variables than just like how good your mitochondria are. But
Yeah.
as a prerequisite for just like all out, say time trial, it appears that your mitochondria are pretty damn important.
100%.
Yeah.
I think that's why this was included in the Vander's Ward review, the mini review, and I hope, being such a good paper, being quite popular now, I hope that some of this results in this research get noticed and kind of kick a little bell in people's minds that, hey, maybe there is something going on here that we should start trying to crack open more, right?
Right.
Duplicate. Yeah.
Yeah, and I do have to say that the method itself of the cuffing protocol and stuff is fairly time consuming to analyze and other things like that. So you need to have somebody who's really good with like MATLAB or other programming languages to detect those changes in cuffing. And then you also have to have like a fairly expensive device that has high sampling rates. However, there is somebody right now in Australia who's doing measuring similar muscle oxidative capacity using Moxie, and he's saying that he's seeing values that are kind of similar to published papers. So if that starts and continues, to be validated, or if, like things like Train Red and Moxie start to come out with, more higher sampling rates, then we might have the ability to non-invasively measure this. The only problem is you still need a Hokinson blood pressure rapid inflation system, which is pretty expensive. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I've looked at the prices. I've already been trying to see.
What's like the cost?
It's in the several thousands. It's
Yeah.
I want to say around, it's upward of 5,000 for sure.
Okay.
I couldn't get an exact price on the unit. I got a price on some of the parts, and I think I seen a used piece somewhere on .med or something like that. But the reason I was laughing earlier is because I've tried to calculate these resaturation slopes myself, and I was like, I couldn't believe how time consuming they were. So I reached out to someone else. I'm like, hey, how do you do this when you're doing it? And he's like, the same way you're doing it, dude. And it's brutal, right? If you don't have 20 years of math to try and figure out, exactly what's the best way to approach. Anyways, it's funny.
Yeah. Yeah. If, especially with, if you're sampling at 100 hertz, you have, over the course of 4 hours and stuff, you have like 4 million data points. And it is, it's a massive headache. So that I think is like the biggest limitation in terms of utilizing this for, like everyday population. But it's a good proof of concept. And as technology continues to grow and get better, hopefully we'll be able to develop, automated systems that are able to do this for us, because like I'm a huge fan of the usage of technology to both promote health and performance, so both of those things. And if you could have like a blood pressure or like a cuffing system and a NIRS device at your doctor's office, and all you have to do is just like sit there, contract your leg as hard as you can for 15 seconds and then relax it and just sit, and you could get a measure of kind of like muscle oxidative capacity. That has a lot of ramifications for, monitoring. Oh, is somebody at risk of developing mitochondrial disease or metabolic disease or something like that? 100%. Or is this person, just going to go and crush the Tour de France real quick? So yeah, that was, I think the big takeaway is that, these traditional variables are still really good at predicting performance. So don't just go, throwing out your metabolic cart and those sort of things, because it's still very valuable and it's a good tool to track over time. But perhaps there are newer technologies and newer variables that we can start to measure and start to get an idea of that might give us more predictive ability going forward, even though we're not quite there yet. It's not quite commercially available. So,
yeah, that was a great summary of the research, and I think it did a really good job in explaining to people that, though we know quite a bit about the indicators of performance, and we have a good base of exercise physiology, there is a wide, vast, open, frontier of things to be grabbed on, whether that's in genetics, whether that's in NIRS, whether that's in some of this muscle fiber typology stuff that's going on. I think there's a lot of people are just kind of been sitting for the last couple decades thinking that, hey, we've kind of hit the ceiling here. But with work like this, it really points out that there's quite a bit left to be discovered.
Yeah, and if there are researchers and stuff that are listening to this podcast, like, please try to corroborate these findings, because I think it's like, it's interesting, or a study is interesting and variables are interesting when they're first published, but unless we have repeatability across a wide variety of populations and those sort of things, then it needs to be applicable to everybody. That's the bottom line. So I would really, really like to see more people do this, use this sort of technology, and especially in the research. So I'm challenging people to do it and publish stuff, and reach out to me if you need help with it. Cause I will tell you all of our protocols and walk you through exactly what we did. Cause I want, to make the field better.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a good ending point, I think, for today. We
Hmm.
touched on a lot on, some of these protocols, their predictive powers, um, some of the main things that can be used in understanding efficiency and where those ranges should lie in terms of speed and power output. Yeah, there's a lot of good tidbits to take away from today. So
Hmm.
if you want to find us, Phil is at critical O2 on Instagram, right?
Yep. Yep.
And up there, he's super active on that platform. Puts out a lot of good content. I'm on Instagram as well, Resilience HBC. Um, Trying to get my post numbers up, but just it's hard.
It
It's
just
hard
takes
getting
time.
back into the game. Yeah,
Yeah, man, I feel that.
yeah. So until next time, we'll catch you later, folks.